So good evening, everyone, and good afternoon to Professor Ward. Thank you so much for agreeing to speak with us today. So today uh, we will be discussing the idea of God with Professor Keith Ward, Regius Professor of Divinity Emeritus at the University of Oxford. Professor Ward has been one of the most elegant spokespersons in defense of the idea of God in an era where New atheism, as it is so called, did rise to prominence across the world in several countries. And there has been a general decline, some would say, in faith in higher powers. It's not often that I have the privilege of introducing a speaker while taking recourse to my own personal experiences, but with Professor Ward, I'll be able to do so. So, I mean, it's been over a decade since I've been watching his content, right when I was in middle school. And I was grappling, like all children, once they transcend a certain intellectual threshold, so to say, they start grappling with the idea of God, or is there something higher than us? And it's often very tempting at that age to latch on to one particular definitive theory and then go around and arguing vociferously in favor of it in a very reductionist manner. And I think New Atheism had a similar impact on many such people around the world. We recently hosted Professor Lawrence Cross to discuss a theme in defense of science, where we discussed why Professor Cross believed that science is the only mechanism through which we can develop an understanding of the world. But today we'll be discussing something beyond science, something which starts, as many would say, where science ends. And that is the idea of God, something which has withstood so many challenges over such a long period of time. So I'll just introduce Professor Ward briefly. So the Reverend Canon Professor Keith Ward is an English philosopher, theologian, and priest of the Church of England. His research interests include the relation of science and religion and the study of religions in the modern world. Professor Ward has written over 50 books on a wide range of issues on the nature and philosophy of religion, Christianity, the relationship between religion and science, the Bible and its interpretations, comparative and systematic theology, and ethics and religion, among others. Two of his recent books are My Theology, Personal Idealism, which was released in 2021, and Adventures in Belief, how I discovered the meaning of life, the universe, and everything. And then there's a possibly in the bracket. Professor Ward is a member of the Board of Governors of the Oxford Centre for Hindu Studies and has contributed significantly to the promotion of interfaith dialogue. He has been a member of the editorial boards of several publications such as Religious Studies, the Journal of Contemporary Religion, Studies in Interreligious Dialogue, and World Faiths Encounter. He has also served as the president of the World Congress of Faith, and he is a fellow of the British Academy since the year 2000. Professor Ward is an honorary fellow of the Trinity Hall, Cambridge, and the University of Cardiff. So, Professor Ward, to start off with, could I ask you to reminisce a bit about all your life and your scholarly interventions in this very long and impressive description that I just read out?
Yes, for sure. Thank you very much for that introduction. I am a person with a great interest in Hinduism, but I'll come to that a little later. I was born in a rural area in the north of England, and then I went to study music at the University of Wales in Cardiff. That's the capital of Wales. But when I was studying there, I began to read philosophy and Western philosophy, basically, which all starts with Plato and Aristotle. And I was really impressed by their work, and that got me interested in philosophy. So I went to Oxford to study with the philosopher Gilbert Ryle, who wrote The Concept of Mind. He wasn't religious at all. He didn't have any faith in a higher power. Though we had very interesting conversations, and I was always more impressed with Plato and Aristotle, who had both believed in God, although their view of God wasn't necessarily a very orthodox one. Well, I studied philosophy at Oxford, and then I got a job teaching logic, in fact, at the University of Glasgow. I remained interested in religion, but no more than that, really. I then moved on rapidly, anyway, to St Andrews University, also in Scotland, and then to King's College London, always teaching philosophy. But I got much more interested in, of course, it would be the Christian religion was the one I knew best, and so I began to study that in more detail. But I always felt that the Western tradition in Christianity, which had in fact derived from Plato and Aristotle, even more than from the Bible, actually, I always found that enlightening, and it prioritized the life of the mind. And so even at that stage, I began to be an idealist. Now, in the West, idealism is a philosophy which would be very familiar in India with people like Shankara Ramanuja, and I think I would call those, looking from a Western perspective, idealist systems. That is, they prioritize mind or consciousness, sat, chit, ananda, and however you translate that into English, I think a usual translation in English is the absolute. That's a term that's usually used in German philosophy, particularly. And what it says is, you know this well from a Hindu background, but it's rather unusual in Western philosophy, or very controversial, really, is the idea that science, natural science, deals with things in the physical universe where there are laws of nature, where you can make mathematically precise predictions, and where you don't really ever ask about the purpose of anything or the value of anything. You just look at the laws of nature and of evolution and then try to work out how they operate. But it was always very obvious to me that there was a whole area of human life that natural science didn't deal with, and that is the world of values and purposes. Natural science doesn't talk about such things, but it's a very natural question. Are there any objective values? By objective, I mean values which we don't make up as preferences that we happen to like, but they actually exist whether or not we're aware of them. Things like beauty and truth, and also compassion. And those are very familiar in Indian philosophy, but they don't fit into a natural science approach. They're just something different. So I was always interested in whether there are objective values and whether there is, in some sense, a purpose to the existence of the universe or to human lives in the universe. So I took a very broad view of these questions. I belonged to the Christian tradition, and I still do, but I take a very open view of that. Namely, I never thought that some Christian movement has the whole truth and you don't need anything else. And I always found the Bhagavad Gita, for example, and in particular the work of Ramanuja, in my case, to be resources of a deep spiritual nature. So I became interested in the Vedantic tradition of Hinduism. Now, I would not call myself an expert in that field. I don't, for example, speak Sanskrit. So I read these works in English translations. So I'm not a primary scholar of Hinduism. Nevertheless, I've taken what I've understood of Vedantic ideas into my own philosophy. And I suppose the most important of these is the idea that there is one absolute reality, Brahman, if you forgive my pronunciation, the absolute in the Western tradition, and that everything that exists is part of that. That also are you. So, whereas in the West, usually God is a conscious and blissful and wise being, God is outside the universe and creates the universe as something quite different. But I think in the main Vedantic traditions, anyway, God includes the universe. In the West, that is nowadays often called panentheism. It's not pantheism, namely the world is God, full stop. It's the world is part of God, but God is much more than the world. And that is often regarded in the West with suspicion. But I think it shouldn't be. When you ask, is the world part of God or not, you're really using the word part metaphorically, because obviously the world is not physical part of God. So in what sense is it a part of God? And there's not really, in the end, much difference between saying, well, God is omnipresent in the world, but separate, and saying that things in the world are parts of God, though they are not, of course, omnipotent or omniscient or have all the divine properties of God. So language is a very flexible medium, but it's all we've got. And these differences, like is the world part of God or not, are also very flexible. And you can say that they give rise to different cultural traditions, but they're not as different as they might seem. Some people like to stress differences and say, oh no, panentheism is not the philosophical view we hold. But if they say that God is present in everything, there's not really all that much difference. So there are some people who like to stress differences and some people who like to stress similarities, which are being put in different conceptual forms. Anyway, that's the background that I was developing. And so I interpreted Christian ideas like, for example, the Trinity or the atonement, ideas like that, in a very wide or generous sense, namely, not as doctrines which give you the exact truth, but as metaphorical expressions, poetic expressions, as something which goes beyond language itself, so that the language about God is a pointer to a reality which you can't quite always grasp. And I have found this in the Vedanta tradition much more clearly expressed because the Western tradition, the Christian part of it in particular, to speak as though they have the truth and it's the truth and we know what it is. You have to say immediately the Western tradition also says that God is ineffable, and so there is that tradition that we don't really give you the absolute truth because our concepts are just not adequate to do that. Anyway, that's that background of philosophy that I was beginning to develop. After London, I went to Cambridge and I was Dean of Trinity Hall, which is a sort of teaching role, but also look after the care of the students. I stayed there for a while and then landed up as the Regius Professor of Divinity at Oxford. There are two things to say about that. The Regius Professor, that means the royal professor, and it's somebody who is appointed by the crown. So that's what that means. And then divinity is interpreted in a very wide sense. You could really use the word religion. So in fact, I was a Christian priest, but I also was instrumental in getting the Hindu Centre in Oxford founded under its wonderful director, who was not me, and I've always been closely associated with that. So that's my intellectual background, philosophical really, and Western philosophy, but always trying to see what the Indian, particularly the Indian tradition, can help to interpret the Western view in a slightly different way. I've mentioned one way in which this is true, that the world is part of God, that all of us are, in some sense, parts of the one absolute reality. But there are other features too. One is that I think the Indian traditions have always had a more cosmic view of God or Brahman. When I'm speaking of the absolute, of course, I'm not speaking of particular gods like Krishna or Kali, but of that of which they are images. And as I understand it, Ramanuja's view is that there are many, many worlds which are part of the absolute reality. The planet Earth is not the center of the absolute interest, it's just part of reality. And that contrasts with the Christian view that is often held by Christians, that the earth is the center of the universe. Of course, it's not. But I mean, it's been common for Christians to think this and to think, as Thomas Aquinas, the 13th century Catholic philosopher, said, all things are created for the sake of man, that is, humanity. I think that is nonsense, and that humans are part of a much larger cosmic whole. And on the whole, the Indian tradition is familiar with that. So that Indian tradition is much better at seeing God, if I call it God, as that which includes many worlds, many galaxies and planets and spiritual worlds, whereas Christians haven't really been very good at stating that. So that's another, the cosmic aspect of Indian philosophy for me has been very important. I also think that Indian philosophers have a very flexible view of revelation. That when you talk about revelation, although I'm sure many Hindus think there is a text which has been dictated by the gods, on the whole, Vedantins really go deeper than that. I think it's deeper anyway, to say that revelation is what we can understand of the absolute reality, and that it is based on the experience of great gurus or teachers or spiritually enlightened people. One Western philosopher calls them spirit persons, persons of spirit. And my view is that Jesus is one of those, and that it's not that there are teachers of false religions around the world, though I'm sure there are actually, but it is that there are many spiritually enlightened thinkers, Jesus being one of them. And it would be fair to speak of some of them, at least, as images of the absolute. That's how I see a contribution that Vedantic philosophy makes to seeing how revelation operates through the experience of spiritual adepts. And I find that interesting because, in Christianity, Jesus, who is the spirit person through whom we appreciate the absolute reality, Jesus never wrote a book at all. Never wrote one. We don't even know exactly what Jesus ever said. Why not? Because he spoke Aramaic, and the only record of his words is in Greek. So we don't actually have any, we do have some, but very few words were actually spoken by Jesus. So in a sense, although Muslims say that we are the people of the book, that's not quite true, because Jesus never wrote a book. The people who did often didn't meet Jesus, like St. Paul, for example, who's very important in Christianity, but as far as we know, he never met Jesus at all. Except he said he met the resurrected Jesus beyond this realm, but never met the historical Jesus. So again, I think that Christians have had a very limited view of revelation in a book which you have to believe everything the book says. And although people like Ramanuja are very interested in commenting on the Upanishads and the Gita, nevertheless, they develop an idealistic system which is open to interpretation. For example, one passage from Ramanuja I like is when he writes that Shankara was deluded. Well, I find that very interesting, because it shows that different Vedantins can have very different views while accepting the same sort of revelation. So there's more room for interpretation of revelation in Vedanta. So, believing these things, I just carried on. I found it as a Christian minister, I can say these things. I don't use Sanskrit language because people, on the whole, wouldn't understand that. But I try to put it into terms more similar to those used by Plato and Aristotle. I've written all this stuff in too many books, really, partly because I've wanted to overcome the limitations of particular worldviews. I think many Hindus, of course, have very limited views, but Christians certainly do. And to look at religious experience of the absolute reality in the lives and teachings of great enlightened teachers. So, given that view, I would not say that any written doctrine is the final and absolute truth, but there are spiritual teachers who know more about the truth than, for example, I do. So perhaps there are many ways to approach the absolute reality. Maybe that will do for my little autobiography. It's been mostly about ideas. I mean, I am a human being and I eat and sleep and I have a family and children, so I'm human, all right? But the important academic things about my life are the way I've tried to think about two major issues. One is, what's the relation between different faith traditions, especially between Hinduism in its many, many forms, and Christianity, which has many forms too, of course. I think it's a great mistake to talk about Hinduism or Christianity as though it's only one set doctrine. That it's hundreds of different ways of approaching these issues. The other thing I've been mostly interested in is the relation of science and religion. For Christians, this is circled around evolution and the story of that, but for Hindus, that's not, or should not have been any sort of problem because of the doctrine of rebirth. There's no difficulty about it. And of course, people like Isaac Newton, but we need to remember that he, for example, was a very committed Christian and wrote lots of books about Christianity. So I hold that science is rooted in religion, and most of its great historical practitioners were in fact Christians. They're Christians because that's the culture and the imagery about the absolute that was familiar to them. But I think, again, there are insights from other traditions which might help. Well, I hope that gives an idea of where I'm coming from. I have to say, I'm well retired now, of course, but most philosophers in Britain think I'm too religious, and most religious people think I'm too philosophical. So I just carry on thinking, well, at least there's a great idealistic tradition in India too, and people ought to know in this part of the world more about that. And that's what I've spent my life trying to do. End of autobiography, as far as I can remember it.
Thank you so much, sir. There is indeed a lot of things that you mentioned that I would like to discuss. I'll just let everybody know that the chat box is open, so you can start sending in your questions, and I'll either take them up or I'll during the course of our conversation, or I'll take it up at the end. You could also alternatively switch on your video and ask your question to Professor Ward face to face towards the end end of the meeting. Right. So there's that. Right. Thank you so much, Professor Ward, for that address. Um, One charge which not just the new atheists, but even fundamentalists of different, let's say, of different religions have subconsciously imbibed, and that which you have negated through the course of your address, is the fact that the nature of reality, as well as the nature of divinity, is far too nuanced to silo down into one particular tradition. And you have discussed how you took insights from the Vedantic tradition, besides the great Western tradition that you were initiated into as well, right from the Greco-Roman traditions and the Christian tradition. How did you personally overcome, let's say, the the very natural human tendency to be caught up in your own framework and to dismiss all other frameworks? You've discussed the genealogy, but how was it like to, let's say, recognize the fact that there is genuine value in traditions other than the one you were brought up in?
Well, I think the main reason is that I wasn't always a religious person. In fact, most philosophers in Britain are not religious. They're not necessarily atheists, but they don't practice religion. So I was one of those. When I was just teaching philosophy, um, I was interested in religion as a set of odd ideas, um, but I didn't take them seriously. Most of my teachers were not religious. Freddie Ayer, that's A-J-Ayer, Ayer, was very famous in Britain anyway as a logical positivist. And he believed that only science, as you mentioned in your introduction, could give you truth and that everything else was nonsense. In fact, Ayer used to say, I'm not an atheist because I don't know what the word God means. I can't believe in it. I was brought up in a very secular way in philosophy. And so that's one reason why I was never tempted to think um, that the Christian way was the only truth. It came to me as a new set of ideas, really. Um, and the other thing of the same sort is that when I was in Oxford studying as a graduate, student there, the three main professors were Gilbert Ryle, who thought that I don't know how to put it, but he was a sort of behaviorist. That is, he thought that there was no secret introspective world of inner thoughts, but it's just human behavior that you have to deal with. He thought that. Then A.J. thought, oh yes, the whole world is made up of sense data, that is, inner thoughts. And then there was Hare, uh, John Hare, Richard Hare, who thought that religious language was a sort of instructive moral tale, but it wasn't literally true. So what I'm saying is I was brought up as a virtual atheist and as a person who knew that the most intelligent people around all disagreed with each other about almost everything. So I think being a philosopher in Britain at this time means you know that this disagreement is universal. Any two people, if they talk long enough, will disagree. I think that's a good thing, but at least it stops you thinking, oh, I've got the truth, and I know that it's true, and you are absolutely wrong. I don't think a philosopher these days can hold that. And I wish that theology or the study of religions was the same, right? That it just knew that the disagreement is inevitable. You have to have a view yourself, and you're going to think it's more or less true, but you're never going to think it's the only possible view a rational person could have.
This is very interesting how you mentioned that among your own professors, you had, let's say, a logical positivist as well. Because in some sense, at least to me, the sort of scientism that I described towards at the beginning, during the introduction, also draws on some sort of logical positivism. That there's this epistemic conceit in the way they conceive of how we may understand the world. At the same time, among scriptural fundamentalists, not just in Christianity or other religions, but even in Hinduism, for instance, wherein there is this, in among some schools, there is a permanent hierarchy of epistemic value. So, for instance, you may have the Vedic scriptures at the top, then you have the non-Vedic scriptures below, and then you have inferences, and then you have perception. So, there is a permanent epistemic hierarchy even here.
Yeah.
So, do you think that the notion of a permanent and unchanging hierarchy of epistemic value is something that we can maintain? Is that the root of, let's say, the conceit of theists on one hand and anti-theists on the other hand, or is there something deeper to it?
Uh, I don't think that most people are interested in these academic arguments about truth at all. And I think the reason people join a religious movement is more to do with uh, if they seem to think in ways that you admire, or you have a very interesting social life, or you like the ceremonies, you don't really think much about the ideas. And I really think, having taught philosophy and having a wife who is a brilliant historian but doesn't like philosophy, I'm aware that some people just find philosophical arguments completely irrelevant. And that's true in religion. So yeah, I think you look for the differences between religions in cultural factors, how people dress, what they do, what they like to do, and what they approve of and what they disapprove of. But they don't really get interested in a discussion about Brahman or whether Maya is a sensible doctrine. They'll go to sleep if you talk about that. So maybe I don't do it very well, but anyway. uh, so I think it's just a few people are interested in the academic and the doctrinal side of religion. But and most people are content to accept some authority without really criticizing it too much. I don't know if you agree with that, but that's my experience. When I preach, for example, I do preach in churches, and when I do, people don't say, "Oh, that's true." They always say, "Oh, that's very interesting," which in English means, yeah, well, I don't think about that very much.
Well, I think it's true that for the average person, they aren't interested, even though they may claim that they find it interesting. They aren't really interested in the deeper philosophical underpinnings of such discussions. But at the same time, while listening to your talk about how there was this distinction between, let's say, the natural sciences, which had a certain approach to uncovering reality, and let's say theology, which had, it does seem to me that we tend to compartmentalize knowledge in some sense, that we accept a different hierarchy of authorities in one frame of, let's say, of intellectual endeavor, and other ones in other frames. Is this distinction really coherent in your view?
No, I don't think it is. But again, talking about the UK, science has such an impact in improvements in medical care and mobile telephones. I mean, science obviously works. And the most popular speakers, like Richard Dawkins, if you've heard of him, I don't, but he's one of the most eminent speakers. I mean, he does it very well. I've debated with him in public many times, and he's a brilliant debater. I think almost everything he says about religion is totally wrong, but he's got a tremendous influence, and he's a reasonable scientist too. Actually a zoologist, that's what he is. And he's just a brilliant speaker, and it just so happens that most of the people who speak about science and religion on television, for example, are not religious. So that's just become the accepted doctrine. As I say, I'm all in favour of people who don't think very much. I don't mind about that. But still, it is a fact that people are going to accept the authority of people like Richard Dawkins because he's such a good speaker, and he is a scientist. You see, scientist is the crucial thing. Religious people in the British society are thought to be narrow-minded and intolerant and even violent. I mean, there are enough violent religious people after all, whereas scientists are usually not violent, and they can usually prove the things they're talking about. So science just has the leading place in people's thought. If you walk into a bookshop in Britain now, you will find no books on a serious academic discussion of God. But you find actually hundreds of books about magic crystals, which will make you fit and healthy and make you live forever. So it's a strange world we live in. And so the intellectual arguments, well, I think obviously they're vitally important, are not in practice what moves people to join a religious department. And so I spend most of my life trying to make religious people less religious and more spiritual, if that makes sense, right? Less committed to one institution, which I think is the best one, and more people who think what is the most fulfilling spiritual relationship I can have. People respect that. But only a minority will actually adopt that attitude. And I think the religious task now in places like Britain, I think in India things would be different, but in places like Britain, the main task is to get scientists, for example, who are committed to faith in the absolute and relationship with it in experience, to get them more publicly accessible. I know lots of them, and what they say to me, oh, I'm a scientist, that's not my job. but it's a pity. So religion in Britain is losing the publicity race. It doesn't have a high place in pupils' interests. People like gardening and baking, and quite right too, but there are no respectable philosophy programs on British television now. There used to be, they've gone. That's a bit controversial. People are going to write to him about that and complain. But anyway, I think it's true.
At the same time, the point that you mentioned about there being, let's say, more books on magic crystals, at
Yeah.
least to me, is a sign of the fact that people are dissatisfied with a worldview which is purely materialistic or scientific. So they look for shortcuts, let's say, ki, oh, all right, medicine may not be that efficient, but hey, this crystal ball will help me to do that. As opposed to, let's say, accepting spirituality as a medium to coming to terms with the fact that life is but ephemeral, at the time that we spend on earth. So do you think this that are you optimistic about, let's say, the fact that in the future we may find a gradual recognition of the value of religion and spirituality given these conspicuous signs of the dissatisfaction with materialism?
Yep. I very much hope that's true. But if you look at, we hear a lot these days about fake news and about conspiracy theories, and things like in Britain and in America, more in America, people say vaccinations against COVID, for example, are a plot by the government to brainwash people. I mean, just crazy talk like that. And yet thousands of people in America believe that. Even the director of health believes it. It's crazy. Uh, so I'm a bit pessimistic about um, and if people preach hatred, and they do. You've got, I don't mention too many names, but I think it's obvious that both Trump and Putin preach hatred of certain groups of people. And if people are moved by that, it won't be towards good religion. It'll be towards bad religion. So yeah, I hope you're right that, and I think you are right to this extent. People have a sense of spiritual need, but I think they can't identify what would meet that need. And I'm afraid the Orthodox Christian churches, which around here are the only ones they usually come across, are being filled with revelations of hypocrisy and abuse and all things that put them off religion. So, so I hope you're right, and that people can do a more spiritual view. That's all I can say, really, because I can't. Nobody can predict what's going to happen next. And we who like spirituality must continue to argue for its importance, while avoiding those views which are less defensible. I mean, there are less defensible views. For example, I'll name one in Christianity. There are thousands of Christians, and perhaps millions, who think that Christianity is opposed to the theory of evolution. Now, that means they're going to be anti-science. And that means they shouldn't be using mobile phones or going to the doctor. But it doesn't work like that. So education in religion is very important. And I think channels like yours may help that process of education. Some people think the religious education is just learning more and more about your religion and how much better it is than everybody else's. That is not education. Education is having a broad view of what there is that leads people to have different views. And so that's where a big fight, academic fight, not a violent one, lies in the modern world, to say that if you're seriously concerned about truth, you will have to investigate the range of views that there are in the world. And so, may your channel thrive.
Thank you so much, sir. I think Dia has a question that she'd like to ask verbally. We have one more question in the chat box. Dia, you're unmuted. Please go ahead.
Right. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Right. So, good evening, sir. I was so privileged as to read a couple of pieces by you wherein you presented a critique towards Richard Dawkins. Now,
Yes.
how do you reconcile the concept of God as an unembodied mind with Dawkins's assertion that belief in a personal deity is delusional at best?
Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Was there a question? I'm sorry. I heard what you said, and it's true. That's the argument. What were you
Yes.
asking?
My question is, how do you reconcile the concept of God as you present it against Dawkins's assertion?
Right. Well, Richard Dawkins, who I know very well and are actually quite friendly with, but in public we are enemies, of course. And he thinks religious people like me are suffering some sort of disease, and but for a start, I don't think I am suffering from a disease, so I object to his characterization. Why is he not suffering from a disease in not believing him? It's a silly argument, really. You must be mad if you believe certain things. But the basic problem you put your finger on, really, could there be a mind or a consciousness without a physical body? He thinks there couldn't, and that consciousness is a byproduct, an accidental byproduct of physical evolution of the brain. Now, I totally agree that consciousness is channeled through a physical brain, and that without a physical brain, there couldn't be human consciousness. But if you ask the question as a philosopher, could there be consciousness without a brain or body? Philosophers should say, well, of course they could. Well, why do you have to have that link? We agree there is that link. Let me try a similar and analogous question. Could there be a world without the law of gravity that we have? Well, we all agree there is the law of gravity and it operates everywhere in our physical universe, but there could be another universe with totally different laws. And I think most scientists will accept that. So a thought experiment will show you what might be possible, even though it's not happening in our universe. That's the case with consciousness. In our universe, our consciousness is channeled through a physical brain. But you could easily have a universe which there was no physical objects in our sense. I mean, no things with mass and spatial extension, but there was knowledge of things that were going on, like it would be telepathic knowledge, perhaps. Philosophically, I think the answer is there could be. As far as we can see, there's no reason why not. And of course, people who believe in God do not think. I mean, Ramanuja, my favorite Indian philosopher, said the world is the body of God. I would, in a sense, accept that. But of course, the world doesn't have a brain. I mean, the universe has no brain or limbs or anything like that. So again, his statement is metaphorical, but couldn't there be that is the key question. You're absolutely right. Could there be consciousness without a brain giving data to that consciousness? And I think philosophically, the answer is obviously, as far as we can tell, there could be. So I think Caucus is just having an unproven and really rather unrealistic idea that what doesn't happen in our universe couldn't happen anywhere. That's just a dogma. So he's the dogmatic person, not me, as I say to him. So he says, you're mad, and I say, you're dogmatic. And then we have a drink.
So, as an interesting follow-up to your response about the fact about whether it's consciousness that should be given primacy or not, I'm reminded of the Yoga Vashishta. And the
Yes.
Yoga Vashishta really talks about how you have the Chidakash, and that everything in the Chitakash or the Bhutakash is really happening in a much more fundamental space of consciousness of Brahman. Are there any such equivalents that you could trace, let's say, as you were discussing in your talk, that you tried to distill these through the framework of the Greeks, so to say? Is there any such equivalent in the Western canon at all of such concepts?
Well, there are very interesting things in Western philosophy. Let me just take one philosophical example. The three philosophers who are most important in Britain are Locke, Berkeley, and Hume. They're called the empiricist philosophers. They all believed that the fundamental reality that we are most certainly and directly aware of is our conscious experience. The theory that our conscious experience depends on our brain is a theory. Aristotle didn't believe it, for example, and it didn't have to be true. You could possibly have a machine which was conscious. I don't think we do, but you could imagine there being some form. But the empiricists certainly thought consciousness is the reality, like seeing, hearing, touching, smelling. These are the sense experiences on which all knowledge is based. Now, you may say that is anti-religious, but actually two of them were strong believers in God, Berkeley and Locke, and they thought that if consciousness is the primary reality epistemologically, as far as knowledge goes, well, perhaps the whole idea of a physical or objective world is a logical construction, a theory, correct theory, as happens, we think, but still a theory constructed out of our experiences, out of consciousness. So within the Western tradition, actually there's a strong element of idealism, that the reality is consciousness, and the idea of an objective physical world is a theoretical construct, which I had difficulty in seeing how it was arrived at. I mean, David Hume, who's the only one who didn't believe in God, he actually said, Well, we can't give any explanation for this. It's just a mystery. Hume said, I don't believe in minds, as opposed to bodies. I don't believe in minds philosophically, but as a human being, of course I do. And that's the big problem of empiricism. But the point I'm making is, yes, we have that tradition that all knowledge begins with experience, and it never transcends experience, but there may be sorts of experience which are not of a physical world. And that's where religious insights, of course, become important, because many thousands of people think there are experiences of a transcendent reality which is not just an ordinary sense experience. So that tradition is there, but somehow it doesn't seem appealing to people. The reason for that is probably that neurology, the study of the brain, has increased hugely over the last 20 years even. And AI, artificial intelligence, seems to show that thinking can take place without consciousness. The only thing is, if you believe that thinking can happen without consciousness, why can't you say that thinking can take place without any physical reality? Well, you can. So I say that Richard Dawkins says to me, he says, intelligence only exists with very complicated physical brains. And I say to him, well, that's true of human beings, but is it true of the whole of reality? And he says, I'm not a philosopher. And he's right.
So, but there are two things that struck to me in your response. One is the fact that certainly there is this tradition of idealism, even in someone like Kant, from what I can understand.
Yes,
But
yes,
it
true.
only extends from the Bhutakash to the Chittakash. This tradition of pantheism or panentheism that you talked about in, let's say, Ramanuja or Shankara, where you
Yeah.
have the Chidakash, where even our mental frame of a thought is subsumed into a broader milieu or background of consciousness. I don't think there were that many equivalents to this concept in the Western framework. Have there been?
That's difficult because they inherited the very traditional Christian view of God as apart from the universe. They, on the whole, stuck with that. So for Kant, you rightly say he was an idealist, he was. But he did also say we know nothing about that other world of things in themselves. We don't know anything about it, which is a very strange thing for him to say. But he didn't believe in any sort of experience of the transcendent. He didn't believe in that. So, although he thought there was a transcendent, he even called it the noumenal world, which from the Greek is the mind-like world. He even called it that. But he still refused to say we had any knowledge, because he also believed that all knowledge must be of physical realities. So I think that's a very paradoxical position to hold. And but he did hold it. So he was an idealist. He thought there was a transcendent world, but we know nothing about it. And my comment to that is, if you know nothing about it, you know nothing about it, how do you know it's there? But, so, yep, there's that tension in the Western tradition, I think, that's there, of an external God of whom we don't have experience because all our experience is of this finite world. But really, as an idealist, you should have known that our experience is where all knowledge begins with. And our experience, the consciousness of reality, is not itself physical. It may have a physical cause, or it may not, but it is not physical. That's the absolute hub. It's the question that people in Britain answer by saying only the physical is real at all. People like me want to say, why should you think that? How would you know that? Aren't there millions of people who are not mad who think there is experience of the non-physical? Even if you know somebody's mind telepathically, and I think you can, even that will be denied as just a story, a myth, a legend. So, yeah.
I just have one question before we take the final question from the chat box. There haven't been any other questions in the chat box. I found it very interesting that you mentioned that, let's say, with the advent of technology, we may potentially, and we already have to some extent, come up with conscious forms of technology, for instance, LLMs or the chatbots or artificial intelligence that is used. At the same time, I came across this argument by John Searle, the
Yep.
Chinese room argument. And it really, what I think about artificial intelligence is that we certainly do know that we can give in an input and get an output. But we don't know that subjective experience of what it is like to receive that input. Like when we are having this conversation, there is something so subjective and deeply personal about it, which can't be reduced to, let's say, me processing words that you say and vice versa. There is this emotional or there is this personal aspect to it as well. But that is something, the emotional aspect aside, we don't even know for sure whether computer programs can really understand as opposed to following a set of rules. Ki if you get this input, this is the corresponding output. Do you think this problem is, let's say, yet another reason to be a bit humble when it comes to, let's say, knowing the nature of mind or positing materialist causes for the entire universe or for ourselves?
Yes, I think you're exactly right. And John Searle, as I'm sure you know, is a materialist. But he does, in the Chinese box example, for instance, he does say that thoughts and feelings are something that a computer could never have. So he holds both of those views because he holds that thought, although computers could never have thoughts and feelings, those things, thoughts and feelings, are produced by purely physical processes. So the physical, although there are both sorts of things, physical and conscious thoughts and feelings, and they're different, nevertheless, the consciousness could not exist without the physical, and it's caused by the physical. So that's why he's really a materialist, because he thinks consciousness exists, but it's caused by and could not exist without the physical. Whereas a believer in God would have to say actually the physical is caused by the conscious, by God. And so they may look alike. It may look as though John Searle is saying, oh, no, I admit there is consciousness, but then he's denying that it has causal efficacy. He does not think that mental events ever cause physical events, but of course they do. My mental events make my own going on. But he would deny that. So he's halfway there, John Searle. But he calls himself sometimes a monist. There's only one sort of reality, but he actually is not a monist. He thinks that consciousness and physical reality are different, but the consciousness depends wholly on the physical. And of course, he's not then an idealist after all, but he ought to be.
Okay, just as a final aside before the final question, because this just struck to me. How do you evaluate Professor Daniel Dennett's, let's
Yes.
say, conception of consciousness? Because he always seemed to me like one of the milder and more open-minded of the new atheists, as
Yes.
opposed to some of the
Yes.
others.
I know him very well too. He's a delightful person. But his view is really, I think, absolutely untenable. And that is that consciousness doesn't really exist at all. One of his most famous remarks is that in the future, we will no longer say, I have a pain in my head. We will say, oh, neuron 456 is now firing in my brain. I can't even begin to imagine that happening. So he just says consciousness is a physical thing. It's not really there at all. My own philosophy tutor, Gilbert Ryle, said this long ago, and he said, actually, you don't have mental images. Like, for example, you close your eyes and you think of being in Delhi, and you think of Delhi and you see it, and you remember a building there and you see it. I can see that building. And Gilbert Ryle said, no, you can't. You just think you can. And I would say to him, but I'm seeing it. There it is. And he said, no, you're not. You just think. And I said, I had a dream last night and all sorts of things happened and I can tell you what they were. And he said, no, you just woke up and thought you had a dream. So what do you do with a person like that? And Daniel Dowden says the same thing. You just thought you had a pain. My goodness, it hurts. It actually hurts. It's real. So I just think that's he's a very, very good philosopher and knows a lot about science, but he's just totally wrong. There are things I experience that he says don't exist.
This really reminds me of one of the late Sir Roger Scruton's work, The Soul of the World, where he
Obvious.
pointed out that it's how ridiculous it is to, let's say, analyze the Mona Lisa through the optical properties of certain pigments,
Yeah,
rather than the sense of awe that it inspires in us. I
that's
think that
right.
is really one of the dangers of scientism. Right.
Yes.
All right. There haven't been any more questions in the chat box, so it's just Shubh's question, which I had mentioned earlier. All right. So Shubh Masur asks, he's a student of sociology, he mentions, and his question is, uh, good evening, Professor. It's been rather interesting to listen to you so far. Just to deviate a little, As a student of sociology, I've had the chance to read the works of scholars like Bronislaw Malinowski. And along the same lines, you'd like to ask, how do you perceive some of Malinowski's works such as Magic, Science, and Religion? And how do you think globalization and secularization have affected or distorted the idea of religion, which was accentuated in the works of scholars like Malinowski?
Yes. Okay, good question. But the trouble in answering it is it's quite general in a way. It here there hasn't been a specific example to look at. So I I don't think I could answer it with reference to Malinowski, unless I knew which bit of Malinowski we were talking about here. Yeah, could you elaborate on that, maybe? Which
Okay,
idea?
I think what okay, let me paraphrase the question there.
Yep.
Um, I think one element that throughout the conversation, okay, I'll draw on the antecedents to contextualize this question. One thing that really strikes to me and has struck me throughout this conversation is the cultural contingency of the
Yeah.
idea of God as it was perceived
Okay.
across different cultures.
Yeah.
Now, with the rise of, let's say, the 19th century, the 20th century, a globalization, and a certain degree of secularization, which culminated in the sort of, let's say, movements such as New Atheism, how do you think the idea of religion has evolved through these different pressures?
Well, yes, that has happened. I agree. The process has happened. It's very difficult to say why. I mean, you can look at it two ways. Globalization could be seen as good or as bad. So it depends what you think of that. I mean, I think the good aspects of globalization are that you learn more about the variety of ways in which different people think. And if you take that in a positive sense, that will actually increase your understanding of religious approach to truth, namely, will rule out totally exclusive views of having the whole truth. Right? And that would be a good thing, I think. It's a way of saying, why don't you say there are many different ways, culturally influenced, of course, of understanding the truth? That would be the case in physics, not just in religion, be the case in everything. But you can take globalization in a negative sense, and when it would be destructive, and you'd say, oh, people believe so many different things, and most of them must be false because they disagree with each other, so none of them are probably true. Okay, so you've got these two possible responses. On the one hand, an expansion of your understanding to say there's a lot of diversity, and there's probably a core of truth there, which we have to still discover. In other words, the truth lies ahead, and we may be able to draw nearer to it. That's the positive view. But a lot of people have taken the negative view and said there are so many differences and they're just incompatible that we can't believe in truth anymore. And that's where things have gone. I think people have taken a negative view. Too many disagreements mean we can't believe any of them. You know. I would take the positive view, which is probably not Malinowski's really. And the positive view is the more you learn about human diversity, the more you come to think there must be a core of reality in all these claims, but what it shows is that cultures and histories make a difference to the way things are perceived, and that means there's the possibility of a much more tolerant and accepting view of religion. So as a Christian, I can say, this is not the whole truth, the final truth, or the only truth. It is a way that appeals to me and I find helpful, but I find in other traditions that there are things my tradition hasn't taken seriously enough, and I can use this to learn more. So I'm certainly a positive globalist, but I think one of the strong cultural movements in the modern world is to reject globalization in a positive sense. And it's a hard way. I mean, we want to preserve the traditions of our own culture, but we don't want them to be regarded as the only reasonable answer to things. So it's that sense of seeing yourself as others see you, which philosophers try to do, and I think that also those involved in religion should try to do as well. I hope. And that's a sort of short answer to a very difficult and interesting question.
What about the second part of secularization? Because other than globalization, there has been this overall trend of secularization of, let's say, the public sphere and civil society as well.
Well, actually, on a world scale, religion has never been stronger. Christianity and Islam, in particular, are expanding at a terrific rate in China, for example. So if you're looking at it globally, you're going to say religion is getting stronger. But people like me would say that's not good, because it's not the right sort of religion. Right? That the forms of Christianity, which are proving very attractive in places like China, are very exclusive forms of Christianity, saying we've got the truth and everybody else is wrong. And that's not what I want. So secularization is not actually a worldwide phenomenon. It's prevalent in some countries among some people, but I think you would find, sociologists do find, that a sense of the spiritual or the magical or the uncanny or something more is very, very strong throughout the world. But the Orthodox traditions have been shown to be limited in many ways. So I don't think it's secularization usually, though it is in Britain for special reasons. I think it's that what you might call spirituality without much critical thought that has become prominent, whereas institutional religion has become suspect because of the behavior of its adherents. And secularization, I think, is a temporary phenomenon which I don't think it'll last. The question is what will follow it. Will there be lots of more negative religions? Ours is the only truth? Or is it going to be a more positive acceptance of religiousness, without insisting on unique and final truth. Well, that gives my view, but it's because I'm a philosopher, and therefore everybody would regard me as just a little bit odd. But I still think I'm right, though not, of course, exclusively right.
Very good point about the reorientation of religiosity in spatial terms, as you pointed out. Do you think, sir, you'd like to give your brief comments on a few additional questions, or should we call it a day?
Well, I am, at this time of day in Britain, beginning to feel hungry. It's a late lunch for me. Yeah, you may have noticed, I hope not too much, that I have a neurological condition which makes speech rather difficult. So, not very clear. But I hope it has communicated in some way. But perhaps it's time to draw to a close, if that is acceptable to you.
Yes, sir, that's perfectly fine. One of the questions I think has in fact already been covered, so I think let's call it a day then.
Good. Well, thank you very much. I very much enjoyed our conversation. And of course, there is a huge amount to talk about, but I'm impressed by your knowledge of Western traditions, and I'll just keep on learning more about Indian traditions.
Thank you so
Okay.
much, sir, for your time.
Thank you. Bye.
Goodbye, sir.